And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hello, I'm meteorologist David Kramer with Alaska Weather. Thanks for joining for our marine segment. Taking a look now at our ice edge. No ice along the west coast. We do have some ice continuing to grow in over the Beaufort Sea, but not quite to land yet. Looking at our weather for the remainder of Monday and Tuesday. We'll start here on Monday, focusing in on the marine areas. Low pressure over the Gulf is going to bring some weak southerly winds to some of the areas around the Panhandle, and some weaker flow up along the North Gulf Coast as well from that low. Out west, we have a front coming in from the west, starting to bring some stronger winds and rain out over the Aleutian Islands, but fairly weak flow along much of the west coast. In fact, from our high pressure up to the north, we will have some weak easterly flow through much of the northern coastline down through the west coast as well. And as we look at Tuesday, as our frontal system moves farther into the Gulf, bringing some strong winds and rain to much of the west coast of the state, some snow as we get farther up to the north and at higher elevations. We're going to see a lot stronger winds with this as well out of the west for much of the areas out over the Bering Sea, becoming more southwesterly as we get by the southwest coast. Coming southerly up along the northwest coastline. Some stronger winds as well for the Aleutian Islands as out by the Alaska Peninsula as well. Out over much of the Gulf, ridging moving in, going to be a lot of weaker flow up in the North Gulf Coast area down in South Central. And then out by the Panhandle area, we'll start to see some more northerly winds as our low tracks farther to the south. So looking at our marines starting off in southeast, we'll see some weaker winds through much of the inside waters around 10 knots there, primarily out of a northerly direction, becoming southeast 20 as we get farther to the south. Then out over the Gulf waters, southeast winds becoming more easterly and eventually northeasterly, starting off at 20 and dropping down to 10 to 15 knots by Yakutat. Then on Tuesday, northerly winds expected all throughout the area, 10 to 15 knots in the inside waters, stronger as we get farther to the south, 15 to 20 for the eastern portions of the Gulf, then diminishing to 10 knots as we get farther to the north. For Monday for South Central, we're going to see northerly winds around 15 knots for much of the northern portions of the Gulf into Prince William Sound. A little bit stronger here by the Barren Islands, around 20 knots there out of a more westerly direction, and then northerly winds 10 to 15 knots in Cook Inlet. And Tuesday, going to switch up a little bit here. Light, almost variable winds for much of the northern Gulf and into Prince William Sound, around 10 knots there. Still a little bit stronger by the Barren Islands, 15 knots out of the west. Southerly winds, 15 knots in the southern portion of Cook Inlet, but becoming easterly around 10 knots as we get farther to the north in Cook Inlet. On Monday for the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, starting by Kodiak Island, northerly winds expected 15 to 20 knots. A weaker flow on the Pacific side of the peninsula, 10 to 15 knots there out of a westerly direction. And then southwest winds 20 knots on the Bering side of the Alaska Peninsula, becoming 10 knots variable and light out in the Bristol Bay area. Then on Tuesday, things are going to pick up a little bit in the Bristol Bay area, becoming southerly, 15 knots. It's going to continue along the Bering side of the peninsula and getting up to 20 knots as we get north of Cold Bay. On the Pacific side, 15 knots expected out of a south to southwest direction, and then southwest 15 knots to near 20 knots around Kodiak Island. On Monday for the eastern Aleutian Islands, westerly winds 15 to 20 knots expected, becoming more southerly for the central Aleutian Islands, around 15 knots there. Really starting to pick up as we get by the western Aleutians out of a south to southwest direction up to as high as 30 knots, with seas up to as high as 11 feet. Then on Tuesday, going to drop down for the western Aleutian Islands, becoming more westerly around 20 to 25 knots there. And as we look out over the central and eastern Aleutian Islands, southwest winds 15 to 20 knots. Along the west coast, we're going to see right along the coastline easterly winds, fairly light around 10 knots all along the coastline. A little bit stronger by St. Matthew Island, southerly winds 20 knots there, and 15 knots out of the west for the Pribilofs. On Tuesday, as that frontal system approaches, we're going to see winds pick up quite a bit. Southerly winds all along the west coast, 30 to 35 knots. And then out by St. Matthew Island and the Pribilof Islands, winds out of the southwest around 30 knots with seas up to 11 feet. Up along the Arctic coastline, we're going to see northeasterly winds, 15 knots there, becoming easterly 15 and down to 10 knots as we get closer towards the Bering Strait area. On Tuesday, again, we're going to see quite a bit of pickup here, especially along the west coast as that frontal system approaches. We're going to see southeasterly winds, 35 knots through the Bering Strait area with seas up to as high as 10 feet, dropping down to 30 knots as we get farther to the north. And then along the Arctic coast, we're going to see winds dropping down all the way to 10 knots as we get farther to the east. With Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer. Thanks for watching.